Before we ride into this story, don't forget, like this video, leave us a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another tale of Wild West love and survival. These stories are built for folks like you, people who still believe the frontier has something to teach us about courage, sacrifice, and the kind of love that refuses to die out, even in the cruelest of winters. Now saddle up, because this one begins in the dead of January 1877, high in the Snowhorn Mountains of the Wyoming Territory, where the wind cut like knives and silence carried secrets too heavy for most men to bear. The man we follow tonight is Silas Granger, a rancher, yes, but more than that. He was a solitary figure, a man whose life had narrowed down to a cabin, a stretch of snow-capped timber, and the sharp rhythm of survival. Folks in the valley below knew his name, but not his heart. Some said he was cold as the land he lived on. Others said he was the kind of man who could walk into a storm and come out the other side unchanged. But the truth, Silas had been carrying his own kind of winter long before the snows ever touched his roof. The mountains were his shields, his pennants, and his silence. Days passed with only the crunch of his boots on hard ground, the snort of his horse when he came back from the hunt, and the crack of firewood splitting beneath his axe. The man had built a life out of solitude, not because he loved it, but because there was nothing else left. The war had taken too much. Loss had carved him hollow. And silence, well, silence was the only companion that never asked questions. But silence can't always hold back destiny. And that's where this story takes its first breath, on a morning when the storm itself seemed to howl with something more than wind. The ridge was dressed in white, every tree bowed low under its weight, every fence post ice stiff. Silas was riding slow, his horse careful, on the frozen trail when he heard it. Not the storm, not the creak of timber, something sharper, a sound, fragile as glass and piercing as a blade, the cry of a child. No, more than one. He reined in, the leather stiff beneath his gloves, and tilted his head. There it was again. Not one cry, but three, faint wavering, carried across the snow like a plea. His gut tightened. A man doesn't hear such sounds in the wilderness without knowing something terrible waits at the end of it. Still, Silas pressed forward, each step sinking ankle deep, the reins firm in his hand, his breath fogging in the bitter air. What he found would carve itself into his memory like fire on stone. There, in a clearing by a half-rotted fence post, stood a woman, if standing could be the word. She was tied cruelly, bound by barbed wire that had bitten deep into her wrists and arms, the steel biting so long it had turned the skin raw and bloody. Her hair was frozen to her lashes, her lips cracked and blue, her body swaying, legs too weak to hold her. And at her feet, 3 bundles wrapped in what looked like the shredded remains of a nightgown. Newborns? 3 of them. One whimpered still, weak and hollow. The other 2 lay silent, their tiny bodies stiff from the cold. Silas's chest tightened. He didn't waste a word. Didn't ask who she was or why she'd been left there. Didn't question the cruelty that tied her to the post or the madness that abandoned babes to the snow. Some things a man doesn't need explained. Some things only require action. He cut her free, the knife biting into rusted steel until it snapped away. Blood welled fresh from her arms, but she did not scream. She only whispered, broken and hoarse, "Don't let them take my daughters." Her voice was so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind, but Silas heard it as clearly as if it had been shouted. And his reply came low and certain, the kind of words a man speaks once and never takes back. "You're coming with me." He lifted her into his arms, her body limp, as though the fight had nearly drained her dry. Then, one by one, he gathered the infants, tucking them close beneath his coat, wrapping them in wool, pressing them against the heat of his chest. They weighed no more than winter rabbits, their cries weaker now, but still there, still holding on. The wind howled as he mounted up, the snow thick and blinding, but Silas set his jaw and pressed forward. The trail back to his cabin was uphill, a half-mile of misery and cold, yet he did not falter. For in that moment his life was no longer his own. A woman beaten and abandoned, 3 daughters born into cruelty, and a storm that wanted to claim them all. This was the weight he chose to carry. And as he leaned forward in the saddle, shielding them with his body, he whispered into the storm. Not to her, not to the babes, but maybe to God himself. "You don't die here, not on my land." That is where the story begins. A lonely rancher, a woman half dead, and 3 newborn girls no one thought would see another sunrise. But on the mountain, in a cabin where silence had once reigned, fire was about to be lit. Not just the fire in the hearth, but the fire in 2 broken souls who would find, against all odds, that even in the coldest wilderness, love can take root. Stay with us, because this is not just a story of survival, it's a story of promise, of how one man's silence met one woman's pain, and together they built something the world could not take away. The storm pressed hard against man and beast as Silas pushed through the mountain trail. The woman cradled against his chest, the 3 tiny lives bundled beneath his coat. His cabin lay ahead, dark and silent against the slope. For years, that place had been nothing but a shelter for one man, 4 walls that kept out wind and gave him no more company than firewood stacked against stone. But that night, as the storm screamed through the trees, it became something else. It became the line between life and death for 5 souls clinging to breath. He kicked the door open with the weight of his boot and carried them all inside. The cabin was cold, the fire long since gone out, the air sharp enough to bite the lungs. He laid Marabel, he did not know her name yet, only that she was too close to death, onto the pile of wool blankets near the hearth. Her skin was ice, her lips nearly blue. For one heartbeat, he stood over her, jaw tight, chest heaving, then turned to the 3 small bundles he had carried in. He set them into the basket he kept lined with rabbit pelts, the same basket he used each winter to keep kindling dry. Tonight it became a cradle, 3 girls still, fragile, fighting against the cold, with only the shallow rhythm of their breathing. Silas moved quick, every motion measured, every sound purposeful. He struck flint to steel, coaxing sparks into flame until the hearth roared to life, heat crawling back into the cabin, pushing the shadows out of the corners. The firelight revealed him as he hung his soaked coat to dry and stripped off stiff gloves, cracked hands raw from the storm. He looked at the woman again. Her wrists were torn. The wire had bitten deep, leaving angry welts and blood that seeped through the makeshift bindings he had wrapped on the trail. Still, she had not cried out, not even when the wire was cut free. There was something in that silence, something that made him pause before he bent back to his work. He filled an iron pot with goat's milk, set it near the flame to warm, and searched out a carved feeding spoon he'd whittled long ago. Thinking he'd never use it, his movements were steady, practiced. A man who had lived alone as long as Silas knew how to prepare for every kind of need, even those he never expected to face. When the milk had warmed, he tested it on the back of his hand, then crouched over the smallest of the girls, whose thin cry had begun to fade into exhaustion. Silas fed her carefully, a few drops at a time, waiting between sips to be sure she swallowed. Her lips clung greedily to the spoon, her throat working in desperate little gulps. He shifted to the next, then the third, repeating the motion with quiet patience until all three had taken enough to still the fear gnawing at his chest. Their color returned in flickers, faint but certain. He tucked the blankets tighter around their heads, layered the furs beneath them, and stepped back only when he was sure they were steady again. When he turned, the woman stirred. Her eyelids fluttered like leaves caught in wind. She whispered something too soft at first, but then he caught the words, "Don't let them take my daughters." Her voice cracked, each syllable broken by cold and fear, but it was not a plea, it was a command, a mother's last defense. Silas crouched beside her, close enough that the fire's glow softened the hollow of her face. "You're safe here," he said, though his voice came rough and low, as though the words themselves were not used to leaving his mouth. She blinked once, twice, as if it took all her strength to hold to his voice. He did not ask her name, not yet. He did not ask what devils had tied her to that post or what kind of man could leave infants to the snow. He only knew one thing: she had been left to die, and she would not die here, not in his cabin, not in his arms. He dipped a cloth into warm water, wrung it out, and began wiping the blood and dirt from her calves. The bruises ran deep, purple-black swells across her shins, as if someone had kicked her again and again. Her knees were scraped raw, her skin blistered with frostbite where the wind had torn at her. His hands, calloused and cracked, moved with surprising gentleness. He worked quietly, never rushing, never breaking the silence except for the soft hiss of water against the fire. For hours, that was all there was, the pop of the flames, the slow rise and fall of 3 infant chests, the steady, shallow breathing of a woman drifting between life and death. Silas did not leave her side, though he never once touched her more than he needed to. He respected the distance, but he stayed near, his presence a silent barrier against whatever storm had driven her here. When the milk had settled in the girls' bellies, when her breathing evened out, Silas sat back on his heels and finally allowed the truth to sink in. His cabin, long silent, was filled now with sound. Soft whimpers, faint breaths, the crackle of fire, the quiet hum of life. For years he had thought himself untouched by the world's cruelties. He had lived apart, hardened by loss, letting silence and solitude do the work of walls. But tonight, those walls had broken. He stared into the fire, jaw clenched, mind turning over the weight of what he had carried into this place. A woman beaten, 3 girls who had known cruelty before they had known sunlight, and himself, a man who had not prayed in years, whispering into the storm, "Not on my land." It was not comfort that filled him, not warmth. It was something deeper, something like a promise, forged not in words, but in the steady rhythm of his breath, as he fed the fire one last time and sat by its glow. Marabel Quinn did not yet know the name of the man who had saved her. Silas Granger did not yet know the shape of the fight that was coming for them both. But in that cabin, as the storm clawed at the roof, and the mountain growled its fury outside, 5 lives balanced between despair and deliverance. And though Silas said nothing, the set of his shoulders, The steadiness of his hands told the truth the firelight could not hide. The silence that had once been his companion was no longer his alone. The fire had burned low, glowing embers casting soft gold across the timber walls. Outside, the storm groaned like an old beast still restless in its den. But inside, for the first time that night, there was a hush not born of fear, but of waiting. Silas sat by the hearth, his back bent forward, eyes fixed on the flames as though searching for answers in their restless dance. The three girls slept at last, their small breath steady, their cheeks no longer pale but flushed faintly with borrowed warmth. The woman lay nearby, propped against folded blankets, her wrists wrapped clean, her skin marked by bruises that told a story of cruelty long before her lips ever moved. It was then, in that fragile quiet, that he heard it, her voice, faint, cracked, no stronger than the whisper of snow against a shutter. "My name's Marabel Quinn." The syllables broke like ice thawing on stone, fragile but clear enough to cut the silence in two. Silas lifted his head. He turned slowly, the firelight catching the planes of his face. He did not rise, he did not press. He only looked at her, his dark eyes steady as though to say, "I hear you, that is enough." She blinked against the firelight, each movement heavy with exhaustion. Her lips quivered, trying for more words but failing. The effort alone seemed to steal what little strength she had left. Her gaze drifted then, away from him, down toward the basket by the fire. The triplets stirred faintly, one sneezing in her sleep, another shifting beneath the rabbit pelts. A mother's instinct lived even in broken bodies, and it was there now in her eyes. Fear, love, a plea wordless, yet deafening. Silas rose at last, crossing the space between them in 2 strides. He crouched down beside her cot, his knees cracking against the rough boards. "Silas," he said simply. His name had grown unused to being spoken, worn thin by years of silence. Yet in that moment, giving it felt like offering a piece of his very soul. Her cracked lips parted as though to repeat it, but the sound never came. Instead, her eyelids fluttered, her breathing hitching once, then evening into fragile rhythm. He stayed crouched there for a moment, hand braced against the floorboards, watching the way her chest rose and fell beneath the wool blanket. Her name lingered in his mind. Marabel. It tasted strange on his tongue, foreign yet solid, like the first step on a trail that promised no return. He leaned back on his heels, the fire warming his face, and let the truth settle. She was not a nameless stranger any longer. When the storm cracked outside, Silas did not flinch. His thoughts had turned inward. For years he had been content with silence, with walls that knew no laughter, with meals taken alone at a table wide enough for 6. He had believed himself finished with names, finished with the weight of others. Yet here he was, crouched beside a woman who had nearly been buried in snow, listening to her carve her name into the air like a claim against death itself. Marabel Quinn. He repeated it under his breath once, quiet as prayer. The fire hissed as resin popped within the log. Silas rose and went to the back of the room where an old trunk sat gathering dust. He lifted the lid and pulled out a fur cloak, elk hide lined with rabbit, thick enough to keep winter at bay. He carried it back to the cradle and folded it carefully beneath the infants, adjusting each small head so they rested deeper in warmth. When he glanced up, Marabel was watching, her eyes glassy but alert. Their gazes met. He did not speak, neither did she. But something passed between them in that look, something that neither the storm nor the cruelty of men could strip away. He returned to the hearth, feeding the fire with another split log, sparks climbing like fireflies before vanishing into the rafters. Behind him, her voice trembled again, softer this time, almost lost in the crackle. "You didn't leave us." Silas did not answer. His silence was not indifference, but steadiness, the kind of silence that meant he had no need to prove with words what he had already chosen with his actions. Still, the words hung in the cabin, heavy with gratitude, threaded with awe. She had lived through a man who tied her to a post and left her to the wolves. Now she looked at another who had carried her from that place, whose rough hands had fed her daughter spoon by spoon. To her, that difference was the line between death and deliverance. He sharpened a blade against his whetstone, slow, deliberate strokes, the sound rasping against the hush. He thought of how fragile she looked, bruises blooming violet on pale skin, wrists raw and bandaged. He thought of the strength it had taken for her to speak her name when the cold had nearly claimed her. A lesser soul would have surrendered to the snow, but not her. She had fought if only to whisper, "Don't let them take my daughters." Silas felt something stir deep inside, old and half forgotten. He did not call it pity. He did not dare call it hope. It was closer to respect, the kind that grows when a man witnesses the unbreakable in another. The storm outside carried on, relentless. But inside the cabin, 5 lives, now, lay stitched together by a fire, a name, and the unspoken truth that silence was no longer enough. Silas could not know what tomorrow would bring, whether riders, lawmen, or worse, but he knew this: the woman was no longer a stranger, and the children were no longer a burden. They were his responsibility, chosen as surely as if the mountain itself had laid them in his path. And so the night stretched on, fire burning, silence holding, until morning's light would show them all what kind of battle lay waiting beyond the ridge. But for that hour, or within those walls, one thing had been claimed, undeniable and permanent. Her name was Marabel Quinn, and she was alive. Morning did not come gently. The storm had passed, yes, but its shadow lingered in the heavy stillness outside the cabin. Snow clung to the branches in thick silence, the world muffled as if holding its breath. Inside, the fire still glowed low, and Silas sat sharpening his knife, each stroke of steel against stone. Measured, steady. He had not slept much. His eyes were rimmed red, though not from weakness. Just the vigilance of a man who knew danger did not end when the storm died. Marabel stirred against the blankets, her body stiff, her eyes fluttering open to the muted light. For a moment she seemed disoriented, the kind of waking that feels like clawing back from the edge of a dark place. Then her gaze fell on the basket by the fire, where her daughter slept curled against the warmth of fur and wool. Relief softened her bruised face, and for the first time, Silas saw a flicker of something else, something beyond survival. A mother's love, fierce even when her body had nearly been broken past use. Her lips parted, and words came, not rushed, not pleading, but deliberate. The sound of a woman who had decided her truth would not stay buried. "I was 17 when I married Joseph Quinn," she said, voice quiet, ragged at the edges. "He was 34. My father told me I was lucky Silas did not look up. He kept working the blade, the rasp of stone filling the silence, yet his ear did not miss a syllable. I thought so too for a while. she went on. He brought me to a house with windows tall as trees. Floors of marble, halls so wide they echoed. I wore silk. I slept on feather pillows. I thought I had been lifted into a life meant for queens. Her breath caught, and she shifted slightly, pain pulling at her ribs. Still she pressed forward. But he never touched me like a husband should. Not kindly, not gently. To him, I was not a wife, just a vessel. And when I bore him a daughter, his eyes went colder than the mountain in January. Silas slowed the stone across steel, the rhythm stretching thinner. His jaw tightened, though he made no sound. The second daughter came, she whispered, eyes dropping to the fire. After that, he stopped speaking to me, weeks, months, silence colder than any winter. I told myself it was bearable, that at least he left no bruises. Her voice faltered, trembling like the flame when wind sneaks down a chimney. But when the third came, her hand lifted trembling to the faint scar along her jawline. He said I cursed his house, called the midwife a liar for swearing the child was whole, told his brothers I was no better than a mule, useless if I could not give him a son. Silas set the knife down, the sound of steel against wood, heavy in the hush. He lifted his head, eyes fixed on her. She held his gaze only a moment before looking away, shame tugging her back towards the floorboards. That night they beat me, she said, the words flat, like a confession already rehearsed in her mind too many times. Joseph led it. His brothers followed. I thought he would kill me, but he did worse. He dragged me to that fence post, tied me with barbed wire, left me for the snow. Said if I lived, it meant God hadn't cursed me after all. Called it justice. Her voice cracked. One hand crept out from beneath the blanket, reaching toward the basket. Her fingers hovered there, trembling, as if even touching her daughters might shatter the fragile thread holding her together. They said girls are nothing but mouths to feed. That I had brought 3 more burdens into the world, the fire popped. A coal broke, collapsing into a drift of ash. Silas rose slowly, the boards groaning under his weight. He crossed to her side and knelt, boots silent against the floor. His hand reached for hers, not grasping, not claiming, but offering. Her fingers were swollen, knuckles scabbed, skin torn from the wire. He took them anyway, cradling them as though they were made of glass. When he spoke, his voice was low but certain, steady as the ridge itself. Here, he said, his eyes holding hers without flinching. Your girls are the only thing worth feeding. The words struck her deeper than any blow had ever done. Her eyes filled, and this time she did not fight it. Tears spilled freely, silent streams tracing the bruises along her cheeks. She bowed her head, breath shaking, but she did not let go of his hand. Silas did not move, did not release her. He stayed there, a presence firm as the mountain, anchoring her to life when she might have slipped away into grief. He had no sermons, no empty vows, only truth spoken plain, that her daughters had value and so did she. For a long while that was enough. The sound of her tears mixing with the crackle of fire, the girls breathing steady in their cradle, and the storm outside fading into memory. Inside something shifted. Not warmth, not yet, but something deeper. A beginning, fragile as a flame in kindling, yet stubborn enough to burn. The cabin held stillness after those words, a stillness neither fragile nor cold, but heavy, like stone laid into place. Marabel's tears had run quiet, leaving her cheeks streaked but calmer than before. Silas still knelt at her side, her battered hand cradled in his palm, the fire casting their shadows tall against the walls. In that silence, there was no need for more, no explanation, no promise. Only the truth of one man's certainty against the ruin she had endured. Morning light pushed pale through the frost-crusted window. It touched the cradle where the three girls slept. Their small bodies curled against warmth that would have been stolen from them if not for chance or providence that Silas had passed along the ridge. He rose at last, steady, quiet, and checked the latch on the door before crossing back to the hearth. He did not look at Marabel again, not because he wished to turn away, but because he knew her strength was still being gathered thread by thread, and his eyes might demand too much of her yet. The hours passed. Snow softened outside, dripping from eaves as icicles cracked free and fell to the hard-packed ground. Inside, the fire ate through another log, the sound of it breaking, filling the small room. The baby stirred and whimpered, fed again by Silas's steady hands, their cries thin but no longer desperate. Marabel, propped with quilts at her back, found herself watching him in silence, the way his shoulders bent low to scoop milk into the carved spoon, the way his rough fingers tucked fur beneath each tiny chin. He was not gentle by nature, she thought, yet he moved as though gentleness had been waiting inside him all along, needing only a reason to come forth. It was just past dawn when the knock came, sharp, quick, caring urgency that cut through the hush of the mountain morning. Silas's head turned at once. His hand brushed the knife on the table, fingers tightening before he crossed the floor. He pulled the door open with a swift motion, shoulders squared against whatever waited. On the threshold stood a woman, wrapped in a heavy green shawl, her breath fogging in the cold air, her cheeks red from the ride up the ridge. Behind her, a horse stood tied to a pine, sides lathered and steaming. She brushed snow from her boots and met Silas's eyes without flinching. "Morning, Silas," she said, voice clipped, sharp as the wind she had ridden through. He gave a single nod. "Hattie." She stepped inside at his gesture, her eyes sweeping the cabin quick as a hawk's, noting the fire, the cradle by the hearth, Marabel propped weakly against blankets. For a breath her brow furrowed, but she said nothing to Marabel, only turned her full attention back to Silas. "It's about her," Hattie said, the words firm, her tone leaving no room for doubt. Silas shut the door against the cold, his back broad in the frame. "Say it. Joseph Quinn's put out word. Says she ran off in a fit, that she's unstable." Hattie's eyes flicked once toward Marabel, then back. "He's telling folks the babes are his by right, that she's keeping them against the law." Marabel's breath hitched. Her arms clutched tighter around the infant she held, her knuckles whitening. The words cut sharper than any winter wind. Joseph's lies were already climbing the mountainside, chasing her even here. Hattie went on, her voice lower now, though no less sharp. "He's hired men, 4 of them. They ride under his coin, and they've taken to saying they're bringing a mother back where she belongs. But Silas..." She paused, drawing a long breath. "The way they ride, it ain't no rescue party." "It's trouble." Marabel closed her eyes, the sting of fresh fear crawling through her veins. For a heartbeat, she thought of running again, of wrapping her daughters and fleeing into the snow, though she knew she wouldn't last a mile. Shame pulled at her chest. Shame that her daughters' lives were marked for danger. Shame that she had brought this to a man who had already given more than she'd had any right to ask. Silas did not move. His jaw flexed once, but his voice, when it came, was calm, steady, unshaken. They'll find this, place Hattie's lips pressed thin, and when they do, they won't take her. The words landed like stone laid into a foundation, final, immovable. Marabel opened her eyes, staring at him, something unreadable passing across her gaze. Awe, perhaps, and fear, too, but threaded through with something else. Something she could not yet name. Hattie searched his face a moment longer, then reached into her shawl. She drew out a small leather pouch and set it on the table. Dried lentils. Jerky spirits. She looked between the two of them, her eyes softening only a fraction. You'll need it. Silas accepted with a silent nod, no thanks spoken, though the weight of his gaze said enough. Hattie lingered only a moment more, then pulled her shawl tight and stepped back into the cold. The door closed behind her and silence filled the cabin again. The rest of that day, motion carried them. Silas worked the latch on the rear window, reinforced the door with a second crossbar, stacked wood within reach of the hearth so Marabel would not need to step outside. He moved supplies into the root cellar, tucked blankets into corners, sharpened his hunting knife until its edge gleamed silver. He spoke little, but his presence was a fortress in motion, his silence louder than any vow. Marabel watched him, torn between fear and an ache she did not know how to name. She had lived her life under a man who left her to die, who counted her daughters as burdens. Now she found herself under the roof of another who asked nothing, who prepared for her safety as though it were his own. The weight of it pressed against her chest until her breath caught. Night fell heavy on the ridge, the fire throwing shadows long and lean across the walls. The girls slept bundled in warmth, their breaths small and steady. Marabel sat near them, her hand resting close, her eyes fixed on Silas's tall frame by the fire. He sat sharpening still, each stroke slow, patient, steady. The cabin no longer felt like a place to hide. It felt like the edge of a battlefield, quiet and braced, waiting for footsteps in the snow. The mountain held its breath the next morning. Not a crow stirred, not a jay sang. Even the creek, running shallow beneath its sheet of ice, seemed quieter than it ought to be. Marabel felt it first, a hush so heavy it crawled into her bones. She sat by the cradle, one hand resting lightly across the bundled forms of her daughters, her ears straining against the silence. It was not peace she felt. It was the kind of quiet that comes before thunder. Silas knew it too. He stood at the hearth, tall frame casting long shadows across the floorboards, his knife gleaming from hours spent against stone. He had finished his work in silence, and now he only listened. His shoulders were loose, his breathing steady, but there was a tension in his stance, the kind that told of storms he had weathered before. Then it came, faint at first, carried thin across the snowbound ridge, the sound of hooves, one set, then another, then two more, slow and deliberate, pressing through the cold like they owned the mountain. Marabel's breath caught in her chest. Her arms moved instinctively, pulling her daughters closer, cradling them against the desperate hammer of her heart. Silas stepped to the door. He laid a hand against the wood, fingers spread wide, his head tilted as he counted the rhythm outside. 4 riders, just as Hattie had said. He opened the latch with calm precision and pulled the door wide. Snowlight spilled in, bright and cold. 4 figures sat astride their horses, wide-brimmed hats shadowing their faces, coats pulled tight against the chill. Their horses snorted steam, stamping against the crusted earth. The man at the front nudged his mount forward. the leather of his reins creaking in the hush. A scar cut down one cheek, puckered and pale, a line that caught the morning light. His hand rested near the revolver at his hip. "Silas Granger," he called, voice carrying flat across the yard. "We come with claim." Silas did not step aside. He stood in the doorway, arms hanging loose at his sides, unarmed but unflinching. His voice, when it came, was calm even. "Speak it." "That woman inside," the scarred man said, jerking his chin toward the cabin. "She's Joseph Quinn's wife, property of his house by law and by right. She took them girls, and we've come to set it straight." Behind him, one of the riders spat into the snow. Another shifted in his saddle, impatient. Their eyes watched Silas like wolves watching a bull elk, weighing how much fight he carried in his frame. Inside the cabin, Marabel clutched her daughter so tight she feared she might crush them. The word property struck her like a lash across the back. She had been called it before, treated as it before, but hearing it spoken here, on this ridge, within the walls that had kept her safe through the storm, made her blood run colder than the wind outside. Silas's jaw flexed once. His eyes never left the scarred man's. "She was never his," he said, voice quiet, but carrying sharp as steel. "And she sure as hell ain't yours." The scarred man sneered. "You think you can stand against Joseph Quinn's word? He owns half the lowlands. His men ride where they please." Silas did not blink. "Not here, they don't." For a moment the air hung thick, as if the whole mountain waited to see which way the snow would fall. One rider leaned forward, hand brushing the stock of his rifle. The scarred man's lip curled. "You think this is over, mountain man? You're 1 against 4. Next time we ride up, it won't be with words." Silas's shoulders remained steady, his eyes unyielding. "You want to test that?" he asked. His voice was calm, almost quiet. "Come back and try." The words struck like a hammer dropped in still water, rippling across the silence. None of the riders spoke. They held his gaze, searching for weakness, some crack in the stone. They found none. At last, the scarred man yanked his reins, turning his horse hard. "Let's go," he barked. "Not worth it today." Snow sprayed from hooves as the 4 turned, riding back down the trail, their shadows long against the pale drifts. But their eyes, hard and glinting beneath the brim of their hats, promised one thing: they would return. Silas did not move until the last echo of hooves had vanished into the trees. Then he stepped forward onto the porch, the snow crunching beneath his boots. He watched the trail, shoulders squared, the cold biting into his face, and only when he was certain they were gone did he close the door again. Inside, Marabel exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her chest ached, her arms trembling from holding the girl so tight. She looked at him then, her eyes wide, searching. She had known men who claimed ownership, men who beat her down, men who left her to die. She had never known a man who stood in a doorway, bare hands at his sides, and told the world no. For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled, the babies shifted, and the silence filled with something heavier than fear, something closer to awe. They were safe for now, but both knew it would not last. Silas walked back to the hearth, his movements unhurried, but his jaw still tight, his shoulders coiled like a man already preparing for what would come next. He fed another log into the fire, sparks leaping, and sat with his back against the wall, his knife across his knee. He did not look at Marabel, but his presence filled the room with the same weight it had filled the doorway, a promise wordless but certain. Marabel drew her daughters closer, pressing her lips against their soft hair. Her heart thundered still, but beneath it there grew something steadier, something she had never known before, the fierce, unshakable knowledge that she was no longer alone. The mountain was quiet again, but it was not peace. It was the pause between storms. The mountain held its silence long after the riders vanished, even when their hoofbeats were gone, even when the wind carried no trace of them. The hush lingered in the cabin, heavy as snow. Marabel's breath had slowed, her arms still wrapped tight around the girls. Silas sat at the hearth, knife across his knee, staring into the flames. Neither spoke. The fire crackled, the babies stirred, and between them stretched a quiet more powerful than any vow. They both knew the riders would return, but for now, the danger had passed, and the mountain gave them something rare, a pause. That pause stretched into days, then weeks. Winter's hold loosened by slow degrees. The snowpack thinned, shrinking back from the ridge, streams carving through drifts that had seemed immovable only a month before. The first buds broke through branches, pale green against the gray of bark. The land woke cautious once small, bloom at a time, and inside the cabin, life did the same. Marabel began to move with more steadiness. At first, she leaned against the wall to rise, her steps halting, her breath still shallow. But strength returned bit by bit, as though each morning she gathered what the mountain offered and pressed it back into herself. She tended to her daughters with hands that no longer trembled, cradling Eloise, Ruth, and June with the ease of a mother whose body remembered how to endure. Her bruises faded, yellow and green softening what had been violet rage across her skin. She did not speak of the scars inside her, not yet, but she sang to the girls in the evenings, and that was its own kind of healing. Silas kept to his rhythms, but they changed. Where once his mornings had been silent departures, hunting, checking traps, splitting wood, now Marabel noticed something new. His absence was never too long. He always returned before the fire burned low, before hunger pressed too hard. He said little of his comings and goings, but his presence became a constant, as steady as the ridge itself. When he entered, boots brushing snow or mud from the threshold, she felt a quiet relief, though she never spoke it aloud. Their words remained few, but their silence shifted. It was no longer the kind that pressed down with loneliness, but the kind that allowed two souls to breathe in the same space without demand. When he fed the girls, spooning milk with patient hands, she watched with eyes that softened against her will. When she sang by the fire, humming songs her mother had once hummed while braiding her hair, she caught him listening. His long frame leaned against the door jamb, tools resting idle in his hands. One afternoon, she stepped outside for the first time since the storm. And the ground was soft with thaw, patches of earth peeking through snow. Silas was at the workbench, sleeves rolled, arms marked with the weather of years, his carving knife cutting careful lines into cedar. She stood in the doorway a long while, the girls bundled in a cradle behind her before speaking his name. Silas. He did not look up at once, but she saw the way his shoulders paused, the knife held steady mid-cut. Slowly he lifted his head, his eyes catching hers beneath the pale light. He gave a single nod before returning to his work, and that was enough. For her, the act of saying his name out loud was no small thing. It was proof of trust, fragile, but growing. That evening, when she returned from fetching water, she found what he had been carving. 3 small plaques, cedar smoothed and oiled until they caught the firelight, each bearing a name in neat script, Eloise, Ruth, June. The letters were not fancy, but they were steady, carved with patience and care. Above the cradle, he had hung them in a row, as though declaring to the walls themselves that these children belonged. Marabel pressed her hand to her mouth, a sound caught between sob and prayer rising in her throat. No one, not her own kin, not even her mother, had carved permanence into her daughters' lives. No one had written their names as if they mattered enough to last. But here, in a cabin far from the marble halls of Joseph Quinn's house, their names gleamed against cedar, strong as any promise. That night, as she sang them to sleep, her voice broke on the last verse. Silas sat by the fire, sharpening his tools, but his hand stilled. He looked up, eyes catching hers. She did not thank him. She only sang softer, and he listened as though the song itself stitched something back together in them both. The days grew longer. Wildflowers pushed through thawed soil, their colors defiant against the gray of melting snow. Marabel took to cooking simple meals over the hearth. Rabbit stew, pine root broth, wild onions Silas brought back from his hunts. She moved with quiet purpose, her step sure, her voice steady when she soothed the girls. Silas hunted, chopped wood, mended tools, but always with an ear tilted toward the cabin, as though his work had shifted from survival for one to protection for five. They did not speak of Joseph Quinn. They did not speak of the men who had ridden away with threats heavy in their eyes. Both knew the shadows of the lowlands would climb the ridge again, but for now, the silence between them was not fear. It was the fragile kind of peace that grows in stolen hours. One evening, as rain pressed soft against the roof, Marabel stood stirring a pot over the fire. She caught herself humming, quiet but steady, and realized the sound no longer startled. She turned slightly, finding Silas seated nearby. His frame leaned back, boots crossed, a pelt draped over his knee. He wasn't working. He wasn't sharpening or mending. He was just sitting, listening, his eyes holding hers with a steadiness that said more than any words could. It wasn't warmth, not yet, but it was something deeper, a beginning, the kind that takes root in silence and grows into a bond not easily broken. The ridge had just begun to believe in spring. Rain softened the ground. Wild violets opened shyly against stone, and the air carried the smell of soil, waking after its long sleep. Inside the cabin, silence had grown gentler, shaped by lullabies and the rhythm of work shared between two people learning how to breathe side by side. But the mountain has its ways of reminding folk that peace is never without its price. It came first as a shift in the wind, the kind of change that steals warmth out of the air and sets a man's shoulders stiff without him knowing why. Silas felt it before the first cloud drew dark across the ridge. He stepped out from the cabin one evening, the last of the daylight bleeding gold over the trees, and tasted something sharp on the air. Not rain, not thaw. A storm, wild and mean, rolling in faster than the season should allow. By dusk, the sky had turned. Snow slashed sideways, heavy and fast, erasing tracks as quick as they were made. The wind howled low, carrying its cruelty straight against the cabin walls. Inside, the shutters rattled, and the girls whimpered in their cradle. Marabel held Ruth and June close against her chest, her body curved to shield them, while Eloise slept by the hearth, unaware of the storm clawing outside. Silas moved through the room, checking every latch, pressing shutters tight against the frames, his shoulders broad and calm. But when he brushed frost off the back window with his knuckle and peered into the swirling dark, his body went still. Figures, 3 of them. Horses pushing slow but deliberate through the blizzard. Cloaks drawn tight, heads bent low. Even through the fury of snow, their shapes were unmistakable. Men who rode with purpose, men who did not fear storms because they carried their own. Silas stepped back from the window. His face was a map carved with certainty, his voice low but sharp. "It's them." Marabel's breath caught. She didn't need to ask who. One look at Silas told her Joseph Quinn had found them. He turned to her then, the storm outside reflected in his eyes. "Take the girls. Follow the creek. Stay low. Don't stop. Don't come back unless it's with law." Her mouth trembled. "What about you?" Silas didn't answer right away. He pulled the old elk fur cloak from its peg and draped it across her shoulders, tucking it close around her frame. Then he took a satchel, pressing bundles into it, jerky dried apples, a small flask. He strapped it tight and placed it in her hands. "I'll lead them the other way." Marabel shook her head, tears stinging, but before she could speak, he pressed a blade into her palm, no longer than her hand, sharp and cold. His eyes held hers steady. "Keep it close. If that they catch up, don't hesitate." Her breath broke. She wanted to tell him no, wanted to beg him to come with her, but words failed. Eloise stirred, sneezing in her sleep, and Marabel's resolve cracked. She bundled the girls, 2 in her arms, 1 strapped against her back, and staggered to the door. Silas kissed Eloise's head, quick and silent, then pulled the door open into the storm. "Go now." The wind snatched at her hair, the cold biting at her cheeks as she slipped into the night. Snow swallowed her quickly, the girl's cries muffled against the roar. She vanished into the trees, her heart pounding like a drum. Behind her, the door swung shut, leaving Silas alone with the storm. He went to work. He dragged a spare coat onto a broomstick and tied it to a fence post near the southern trail. The shape of it hunched like a fleeing figure. He lit an oil lamp and tucked it behind a log to cast shifting shadows. He led his horse halfway down the trail and tied the reins to a tree, as though abandoned in haste. He even built a small fire past the bend, smoke rising faint through the storm, enough to confuse, to distract, then to buy her time. Then he returned to the cabin. He stoked the fire, checked the knife at his belt, and waited. The storm battered the walls, snow piling high against the door. But inside, his stillness was that of a man who had already chosen his end. The knock came minutes later, hard, demanding. Silas opened the door to find 3 men, snow thick on their coats, grim faces shadowed by wide brims. At the front stood Joseph Quinn himself. He hadn't changed much, still handsome in that polished, empty way. But his eyes were colder than the storm behind him. "She took what's mine," Joseph said, voice cutting through the wind. "The girls carry my name." Silas stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him. His boots sank into the snow, his shoulders squared against the storm. "You come this far for lies," Joseph's mouth twisted. "I come for blood." "She belongs to me?" Silas's voice was calm, clear, carrying through the blizzard. "She belongs to herself." Joseph's jaw clenched. He drew his pistol slow, eyes hard. "Last chance." Silas stood tall, unarmed but unyielding. "You'll have to shoot me." The man behind Joseph stepped forward, swinging the butt of his rifle. The blow cracked against Silas's shoulder, driving him down to one knee, snow soaking through his shirt, crimson blooming across the seam. Still, he did not yield. He raised his head, jaw set, eyes burning with the fire of a man who would not move. Joseph lifted his gun, finger curling on the trigger. And a new light cut through the storm. Lanterns swinging from the tree line, voices rising above the wind. Sheriff Mather rode into view, flanked by deputies with rifles leveled. Behind them, Marabel emerged from the trees, her cloak torn, snow plastered against her hair, but her gaze steady as stone. "Tell them what you did," she called, her voice raw but fierce, "or I will." Joseph froze, the pistol still in his hand, but the storm no longer his to command. The law had arrived, and with it, the woman he had once left to die, standing now with fire in her eyes. The storm howled as though the mountain itself wanted to swallow every man standing on that ridge. Snow lashed sideways, stinging skin, coating rifles, swallowing tracks as soon as they were made. Joseph Quinn stood with his pistol raised, Silas Granger on one knee in the snow, blood seeping dark through his shirt. But the light of lanterns cut through the blizzard, steady and unyielding, and with it came the law. Sheriff Mather rode at the front, his horse snorting against the cold, 2 deputies flanking him, with rifles already cocked. The lantern swung from the sheriff's hand, casting gold against faces twisted by shock. Joseph's pistol wavered, though his eyes burned with fury. And then Marabel's voice carried through the wind. "Tell them what you did," she said, stepping from the trees, her cloak torn, her hair plastered with snow. Her voice cracked with cold, but not with fear. "Or I will." Joseph froze. He had known her, voice only as pleading, broken, a sound he could ignore, like the cry of a chained animal. But here, on the ridge, with lawmen watching and storm raging, her words cut sharper than any blade. Sheriff Mather's gaze turned hard. "Drop the gun, Joseph." Joseph's jaw flexed, his teeth grinding. He glanced at his men, searching for courage, but found only hesitation in their eyes. The deputy's rifles never wavered. His pistol dropped, sinking into the snow with a muffled thud. "Arrest him," Mather ordered. The deputies moved fast, dismounting, binding Joseph's wrists with iron. His men followed, their bravado wilted under the weight of the law's gaze. Snow clung to their hats, their eyes darting anywhere but Marabel's face. For the first time, Joseph Quinn looked small, not a man of power, not the master of marble floors and tall windows, but a coward stripped bare on a mountain that did not bend to his coin. Marabel watched, her chest heaving, her daughter safe behind her with Hattie's shawl pulled close around them. Relief surged in her, but it was tangled with fury, with the years of silence and pain that had nearly killed her. She wanted to scream, to spit the truth at him until the whole mountain knew. Instead, her gaze slid past Joseph to Silas. He was still on his knees in the snow, one hand pressed against his shoulder, crimson staining his palm. His face was pale, but his eyes held steady as they found hers. She rushed to him, dropping to her knees, her own breath fogging in the storm. "You're not dying," she said, her voice fierce, trembling. Her hands pressed against the wound, heat and blood seeping through her fingers. "You hear me? You are not dying." His breath came ragged, a grunt torn from his chest. "Not planning on it." "Good." Her tears froze against her lashes, but she didn't falter. "Because I'm not going to bury the only man who stood between us and hell." For the first time since the storm began, Silas's mouth curved into something close to a smile, faint, pained, but real. "Knew you'd come back," he rasped. Her grip tightened over the wound, her forehead bowing to his. "Always." Behind them, the deputies dragged Joseph and his men toward their horses, iron clanking against leather, voices drowned by the wind. Joseph spat curses, his words bitter, his pride shredded, but the storm stole them away. The mountain did not care for the fury of small men. Sheriff Mather swung down from his saddle and crouched low, his lantern casting glow across Silas's battered frame. "Mom, he needs tending," the sheriff said. His voice carried no judgment, only the blunt truth of a man who had seen wounds too many times before. Marabel nodded, her jaw set. "I'll see to him." Mather looked at her, then at Silas. "You've got grit, both of you. But be warned, Quinn's coin still talks down in the lowlands. Today we take him, but tomorrow?" His shoulders lifted in a shrug, heavy with meaning. "Tomorrow's another fight." Silas's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Words meant little in storms like this. What mattered was the hand pressed firm over his shoulder, the woman kneeling beside him, her body curved protectively toward his. That was his answer, and the sheriff seemed to understand. The lawmen mounted again, dragging Joseph and his men down the trail, their lanterns swallowed by the storm until only darkness remained. The ridge was quiet once more, save for the wind's hollow roar. Marabel shifted, bracing Silas against her as she struggled to her feet. His weight leaned heavy, but she did not falter. She wrapped the elk fur cloak tighter around him, pressing her body against his to share warmth. Each step towards the cabin was a battle, snow dragging at her skirts, the storm biting. But she carried him with a strength born of more than muscle. She carried him because he had carried her first. Inside, the fire still glowed, embers waiting to be coaxed alive. She lowered him gently onto the blankets, her hands never leaving him. She worked quickly, cutting fabric, binding the wound with strips of linen, her movements steady despite the tears that blurred her sight. The girls whimpered in their cradle, sensing the fear in the room, but she hummed low under her breath, a lullaby threaded with steel. Silas's eyes followed her through the haze of pain, watching the way her jaw set, the way her hands refused to tremble. He thought of the woman tied to the post, beaten, left to die, and the one now kneeling before him, fierce enough to stand against storm and men alike. His chest burned, not only from the wound, but from the truth he could no longer ignore. This was no burden the mountain had forced upon him. This was a life he had chosen the moment he cut her free. The storm raged outside, hammering the walls, filling the world with its fury. But inside the cabin, there was fire, breath, and the sound of two souls who had stood on the edge of death and refused to fall. The storm passed, as storms always do. The snow on the ridge softened, melting into rivulets that carved through frozen earth, leaving behind patches of moss and tender shoots of green. Winter loosened its grip, and in its place came the slow, patient hand of spring. For Silas Granger and Marabel Quinn, spring meant more than the turning of seasons. It meant survival. It meant rebuilding. It meant learning how to live again, not in silence or in fear, but in something that might finally be called a home. Silas healed slowly. The wound in his shoulder ached, the scar tugging when he lifted his arm, but he bore it with the quiet endurance of a man who had already carried heavier burdens. Each morning, Marabel changed the bandages, her fingers steady, her voice low as she hummed to the girls. He never complained, and she never fussed. There was no room for weakness on the ridge, only the steady rhythm of work and care. Together, they rebuilt the cabin, board by board, until what had once been a place for one man's survival became a refuge for 5 souls bound by choice. Silas extended the east wall, his tools sharp and his hands sure. Marabel painted the shutters with faded green pigment Hattie had brought up from town, color softening wood that had weathered too many winters alone. The hearth grew larger, a stone-lined heart that filled the cabin with warmth, light, and laughter. What had been silence before now echoed with the cries of babes, the scrape of chairs against the floor, and the low murmur of two voices learning the language of trust. Words spread quick through the valleys. Riders spoke of a place on the ridge where fire never went out and stew always filled a man's belly. Travelers began stopping by, fur traders, timber haulers, ranch hands riding between counties. They came tired, hungry, weather-worn, and left with bellies full and shoulders lighter. Folks called it the Hearth at Granger Ridge. For a coin or for nothing at all, a man could find a night's rest, a bowl of venison stew, cornbread sweet with honey, and the rarest gift of all, peace. Marabel was the keeper of that peace. She moved through the cabin with quiet grace, her girls often at her side. Eloise learned to walk between the tables. Ruth's first word, fire, echoed bright as a spark, and June sang before she spoke, her voice small but sure. Guests would lean back in their chairs, mugs of pine tea warming their hands, and listen to the laughter of children drifting in from the porch. To them, it was a balm, proof that even in a land rough with blood and dust, innocence could still survive. Silas hunted, chopped wood, and tended the stables. His presence at the door was enough to remind visitors that trouble would not be welcome to hear. Few dared test him. The mountain had given him a reputation, and the scar across his shoulder only deepened it. Yet those who stayed long enough learned the truth, that beneath the stern lines of his face lived a devotion unspoken but steadfast, a devotion carved for one woman and 3 girls who had turned silence into something sacred. One evening, after the last rider had gone and the girls slept in their cradle, Marabel stepped out onto the porch. Silas sat there already, sanding down a rough board, the sun dipping behind the ridge. He looked up at her, and from the satchel at his feet, he pulled something out. A shawl, woven thick by hand, dyed deep burgundy, embroidered with dark thread. On one corner, 3 initials were stitched, E.R.J. Beneath them, in block letters, one word, worthy. Her breath caught as her fingers brushed the thread. "You made this?" He nodded, eyes steady. "For you?" "Because you are." She pressed the shawl to her chest, tears rising, though her smile trembled with them. "You chose us?" she whispered, "when you could have walked away." Silas didn't answer with words. He only stepped forward, took her hand gently, and looked into her eyes. That night by the fire they exchanged no rings, no vows spoken before priest or crowd. Instead, he offered a string of carved beads, polished smooth, one for each daughter. He looped them over the girls' tiny wrists as they slept. For Marabel, he offered nothing but his hand. And when she took it, she took everything that mattered. Seasons turned. The ridge bloomed with wild violets, the air sweet with pine and earth. Laughter filled the cabin, spilling out into the yard, where 3 little girls chased each other barefoot, hair wild and sunlit. Marabel watched them from the window, flour dusting her hands, a smile softening the years of fear that had once bent her frame. Silas worked the garden rows, shoulders steady, his jaw bent in quiet focus. The silence that had once been his shield was now shared, filled with the music of family, of peace, of chosen love. Travelers still came, sitting at the rough-hewn table, mugs warm in their hands, watching the glow of firelight dance across the faces of strangers who had become more than that. They left with full bellies, lighter hearts, and stories of a place on the mountain where fire burned not just for warmth, but for hope. One evening, as the sun sank gold across the ridge, Silas sat on the porch with Marabel at his side. The girls darted across the yard, laughter echoing like birdsong. Marabel slipped her hand over his, her touch light, familiar. "This fire between us," she said softly. "It never went out." Silas looked ahead, eyes crinkling at the corners, his voice low and sure. It just needed a place to live. And so it lived. Inside a cabin, once marked by silence. Inside the hands of a woman once broken. Inside the laughter of 3 daughters who had been born into cruelty but raised in love. On that ridge, where storms had once threatened to take everything fire endured. Not the kind that devours, but the kind that stays. Some travelers would pass by without knowing the whole story. They would never hear the cries that first called Silas from the trail. Never see the scars Joseph Quinn left behind. Never feel the weight of silence broken by a whispered name. But they would see enough. They would see the way Marabel smiled at him. The way he watched her when she wasn't looking. The way 3 girls danced wild beneath a sky full of stars. And they would know something strong had been built here, not from wealth, not from stone, but from sacrifice, trust, and a love stubborn enough to outlast the cruelest winter.